In a modest garage in Berkshire, a retired engineer built a motorcycle around the entire 8-litre V10 from a Dodge Viper, 9,000 miles on the clock, fully road legal. But here's the part that shouldn't be possible. Hand tools, no factory, no design team, and he rode it to 207 miles an hour on a British runway. Except the Viper isn't even the maddest thing in that shed. There's a V12 forged from two engines never meant to meet. A 5-litre V-twin built from a Second World War aeroplane. This is Allen Millyard's collection. Nobody's sure anyone's ever bolted a bigger engine into two wheels. Patience, we'll get to it. We start small, deliberately so, because it tells you something important about the man before we get to the machines that could shake plaster off a ceiling. In the late 1960s, Honda built the SS50, a 49 cubic centimetres, single-cylinder four-stroke, aimed squarely at schoolboys with a taste for cafe racer glamour on a pocket-money budget. Millyard took two of them, stripped them to the crankcase, and grafted the cylinders together into a genuine V-twin. 99 cubic centimetres, 2 cylinders, 1 crankshaft, built with the same painstaking tolerances he'd later apply to engines 40 times the size. It's widely regarded as the smallest V-twin motorcycle ever built, a title that sounds like a novelty until you actually look at the machining. The cases are seamless. The finning matches. If Honda had built a baby twin concept in 1967, this is precisely what it would have looked like rolling off the line. It's easy to laugh this one off as a warm-up act, but it's the key to understanding everything that follows. Long before the V10s and the V12S, Millyard was proving a principle, that an engine is just a puzzle, and cylinders are simply pieces you're allowed to rearrange, so long as you're patient enough to make the maths work in metal. Now we move into properly dangerous territory, and fittingly, it starts with a bike that already had a reputation for killing people. The Kawasaki H2 Mark IV, launched in 1971, was a 748 cubic centimetre two-stroke triple with a personality problem. It made peak power in a sudden vicious rush that had a habit of putting the front wheel skyward and the rider somewhere in the hedgerow. Racers and journalists nicknamed it the Widowmaker, and it earned every letter of that name. Millyard looked at this already unhinged machine and decided it needed a fourth cylinder. The result is a 1,000 cubic centimetres, 4-cylinder two-stroke, essentially a triple with one more chamber grafted on, producing something in the region of 120 brake horsepower from an engine architecture that was already considered close to unrideable at 3/4 the size. Two-stroke fours of this configuration were never made by any factory. The power band, the crank geometry, the sheer theatre of it exists nowhere else in the world. It looks at a glance like a slightly plumper H2. Sit behind it at idle, and you understand instantly why nobody in Kawasaki's engineering department ever seriously considered building one for the public. If 4 cylinders on a two-stroke triple sounds excessive, Millyard's answer was naturally to go one further. Back in 1996, at the Stafford Classic Mechanics Show, he unveiled a 415 cubic centimetres, 5-cylinder Kawasaki two-stroke built from KH250 components, the bike that first announced his name to the classic motorcycling world. He'd later revisit the idea with larger displacement versions built from KH500 parts, eventually reaching an 850 to 883 cubic centimetre 5-cylinder two-stroke, one of which now lives permanently in the Barber Museum. The engineering here is deceptively brutal. Two-stroke triples fire on a staggered rhythm that already sounds like nothing else on the road. That snarling, ring-a-ding howl that made the Kawasaki triples infamous in the first place. Add 2 more cylinders and a bespoke firing order, and you get a sound that periodically stops conversations dead at classic bike shows, followed by grown men crouching by the exhaust pipes trying to count how many there actually are. Because surely, nobody builds a 5-cylinder two-stroke, and yet in a garden shed in Berkshire someone did, twice. Not every entry on this list was born in Millyard's own workshop, but this one earns its place for a different reason entirely. It shows what happens when Britain's finest one-off superbike needed saving, and there was only one man the National Motorcycle Museum trusted to do it. The Norton Nemesis was a genuine one-off British V8 superbike, a machine that in its day represented a serious attempt at building a homegrown rival to the great 4-cylinder Japanese superbikes, producing somewhere in the region of 235 brake horsepower. Decades on, sitting neglected and in need of serious mechanical attention, the museum's board had a simple question. Who in the country actually understands one-off V8 motorcycle engines well enough to bring this thing back to life? There was only one name on the shortlist: Millyard, the man who'd already built his own V8 from scratch and understood exactly how these unforgiving, low-volume engines behave under real load. Took it on. It's a rare entry on this list for another reason too. It's proof that Millyard's reputation extends beyond his own creations. When Britain's motorcycling institutions have a problem only a handful of people on Earth can solve, they don't call a factory. They call a bloke with a single garage in Berkshire. Here's where the numbers start getting genuinely silly. The Kawasaki Z1 arrived in 1972 as a four-cylinder, 900 cubic centimetre superbike that redefined what a production motorcycle could do. And for decades, it remained one of the most collectible Japanese bikes ever built. Exactly as Kawasaki intended it, 4 cylinders and not one more. Millyard disagreed with that last part. Working from 2 Z1 engines, he engineered a genuine straight 6 of 1,396 cubic centimetres, a bike that looks, at 10 paces, almost exactly like a factory Z1, right down to the correct casting textures and date-coded fasteners. It's only when you count the exhaust headers that the penny drops. 6. There are 6 of them, on a bike that was never in any universe supposed to have more than 4. It's nicknamed, with typical understatement in the classic bike press, the Shed Z, which rather undersells a machine that fools professional restorers at 20 paces. Now, if you've made it this far, you already know this channel lives for exactly this kind of stubborn, quietly brilliant British engineering, the sort that never asks permission and never explains itself twice. So do us a favour before we get into the real monsters on this list. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling us which of these 10 you'd actually want parked in your garage, and if you're not already subscribed with the notification bell on, now's the moment, because we've got 5 more of these to get through, and they only get more ridiculous from here. Millyard, it turns out, is not a man who's satisfied leaving well enough alone, even with his own creations. Years after the original Super 6 proved the concept, he returned to the same idea with a more ambitious build, a second 6-cylinder Z1, this time displacing 1,522 cubic centimetres, built with the benefit of everything he'd learned first time round. More capacity, more refinement, more power, delivered through a crankshaft that has no business existing outside a factory toolroom. Where the original Super 6 was proof of concept, the Super 6 II is the mature, sorted version, smoother, stronger, and by most accounts the better bike to actually ride. What's remarkable is the restraint in the visual execution. Neither Super 6 shouts about what it is. Both wear the correct Kawasaki paint, the correct decals, the correct switchgear. You could park either one at a classic bike meet, and 99 people out of 100 would walk straight past, assuming they were looking at a slightly unusual but entirely ordinary Z1. It's the 100th person, the one who actually crouches down and counts the exhaust pipes, who leaves the car park having genuinely lost their mind a little. Now we arrive at the machine that, more than any other, put Millyard's name into the same sentence as the word legendary among people who take their engines seriously. Built from a pair of Kawasaki 4-cylinder engines, Z1 and Z900 derived components, machined and married together by hand. The Z1600 is a genuine 1,600 cubic centimetre V8 motorcycle, completed back in the 1970s and finished to a standard that has since earned it a permanent home at the Barber Museum in Alabama, displayed alongside genuine factory prototypes and works racers as though it belongs there, which frankly, it does. Picture 2 ordinary, inline 4 Kawasaki engines. Now picture someone deciding those 2 engines should actually be one engine, that the crankcases should share a single crank, that the 2 banks of cylinders should sit at a V angle like a proper American muscle engine, and that every single component needed to make that happen, from the crankshaft to the carburetors, should be made by hand in a domestic garage. That's the Z1600. It doesn't look like a special. It looks like the V8 superbike Kawasaki should have built in 1974, and, for reasons that remain their loss entirely, never did. If the V8 sounds excessive, brace yourself, because Millyard's next move was to take the same principle and apply it to an engine that was already a six-cylinder in its own right, and then double it. The Kawasaki Z1300 was itself a remarkable machine in its day, a 1,300 cubic centimetres, water-cooled straight six-tourer, one of the most mechanically complex production motorcycle engines Japan ever put into a road bike, a machine built for effortless silken cruising, rather than outright drama. Millyard looked at that already ambitious six-cylinder engine and asked the question nobody at Kawasaki ever had reason to ask. What if there were two of them, sharing one crankshaft, arranged in a proper V? The result is a genuine V12 motorcycle engine, displacing somewhere between 2,300 and 2,600 cubic centimetres, depending on which account of the build you read, and producing a note that eyewitnesses describe less as an exhaust sound and more as a low, continuous roll of thunder that you feel through the floor before you hear it through the air. 12 cylinders on a motorcycle, built in a garage that, by every account from those who've actually stood in it, is barely bigger than the average family car. No ramps, no gantry cranes, no team of apprentices passing him spanners. Just Millyard, a workbench, and the patience to align two crankshafts into one that would actually survive being revved in anger. This machine now sits at the Barber Museum in Alabama, alongside its V8 sibling, and by most accounts it's the exhibit visitors linger longest in front of. Not because it's the loudest or the fastest machine on this list. It isn't, not by some distance, but because the sheer audacity of the idea takes a genuine moment to sink in once you actually crouch down and start counting exhaust headers. A V12 is the engine format of Ferraris and Lamborghinis, of aristocratic excess and boardroom-approved unlimited engineering budgets. Millyard built one from two ordinary touring bike engines in his spare time in a domestic garage for no better reason than wondering whether it could physically be done, and then finishing it well enough that it now sits in a museum treated with exactly the same reverence as the factory prototypes either side of it. Every list needs a wildcard, and this is it. The entry that has nothing whatsoever to do with Kawasaki and everything to do with a 9-cylinder radial aeroplane engine that once, in a previous life, might have helped keep a Second World War-era aircraft in the sky over somewhere considerably more dangerous than Berkshire. The Pratt & Whitney Wasp is a genuine piece of aviation history, the same family of radial engine that powered aircraft, including the Lockheed Electra, flown by Amelia Earhart on her final fateful flight in 1937. Decades later, a pair of the Wasp's original cylinders turned up for sale online, priced at roughly what you'd spend on a decent night out, and Millyard bought them on a whim before he'd worked out what they were actually for. It was only afterwards, he'd later explained, that he discovered the previous owner had originally intended them for an entirely different kind of vehicle altogether, a car engine that never got built, which meant that in a strange way, this project had effectively been waiting 50 years for the right person to finally come along and finish it. He mounted the two enormous, deeply finned aircraft cylinders at 60 degrees to a set of entirely hand-fabricated crankcases, machined his own carburetors from scratch because nothing off the shelf came close to fitting, and built a complete period-correct chassis around the result, styled deliberately to evoke the great board track races of the 1920s. Total displacement, very nearly 5 litres. The same swept volume as a small block V8 that once powered generations of American muscle cars, here squeezed into just 2 colossal cylinders on a motorcycle that, remarkably, he had running and complete within 7 months of first laying hands on those 2 lonely aircraft parts. They called it the Flying Millyard, and when he wheeled it out to the Salon Privé Concours, the judges handed it 2 separate awards in the same year, the only vehicle in the event's entire history to manage that particular double. It tops out somewhere around 75 miles an hour, which sounds almost quaint until you remember that each individual piston in that engine is roughly the size of a decent thermos flask, that the whole assembly weighs as much as a small motorcycle on its own before you've added a frame, and that every single working part beneath that gorgeous aged aluminium was fabricated by hand in a Berkshire garage from an engine that was never, in any conceivable version of history, supposed to leave the sky. And so we return to where we began. Back in 2004, at the Goodwood Festival of Speed, Dodge unveiled a concept called the Tomahawk, a 4-wheeled showpiece built around the company's monstrous 8.0-litre Viper V10, more sculpture than motorcycle, A machine so wide and so impractical that Daimler Chrysler themselves never seriously intended anyone to actually ride it. Millyard's own son stood in front of it, looked across at his father, and made him a simple needling challenge. He reckoned his dad could build a version that genuinely worked. On real roads, under real power, with nothing held back. 5 years later, in 2009, it was finished. Conceived, machined and assembled in that same single-car garage in Berkshire that had already produced a V8, a V12, and a 5-litre aircraft-engined V-twin. The Millyard Viper is a genuine, fully road-legal motorcycle constructed around the complete, unmodified V10 engine from a Dodge Viper sports car, 500 brake horsepower, 525 pound-feet of torque, delivered through a driveline that has to survive. Forces most motorcycle components were never engineered to withstand. The engine alone weighs more than most complete motorcycles roll out the showroom door at, which meant nothing about the rest of the bike could be borrowed or adapted. Millyard hand-built a bespoke subframe, a custom front fork, and a beefy single-sided swing arm from scratch, because absolutely nothing off the shelf was ever going to survive being bolted to that much torque. When Motorcycle News took it to the Bruntingthorpe Proving Ground later that year, their chief test rider recorded a genuine 207.1 miles an hour on a machine most engineers would have insisted couldn't be made stable at half that speed. It has since covered more than 9,000 road miles. Not garage queen mileage, actual miles, actual weather, actual roundabouts, and earned a Guinness World Record along the way. Then in 2023, well over a decade after it first turned a wheel, Millyard climbed back aboard and set the official world speed record for a tandem motorcycle at 183.5 miles an hour, with a passenger riding pillion behind him, as though the whole exercise needed one final, faintly absurd flourish. Millyard himself has called it one of the most significant machines he's ever built, and it isn't difficult to understand why. Every other bike on this list represents a kind of clever multiplication, doubling an engine, tripling a cylinder count, borrowing a format from somewhere it was never meant to go. The Viper is different. It isn't multiplication at all. It's simply taking the single largest, most brutal engine you can reasonably get your hands on and asking the one question no motorcycle factory on Earth would ever be permitted to ask. What happens if we just don't put a limit on this at all? The answer, it turns out, is 207 miles an hour, a Guinness World Record, a tandem land speed record set nearly 15 years later, almost as an afterthought, and a modest single garage in Berkshire that has quietly out-engineered entire corporate research departments without ever once leaving the ground floor. That's the thread running through every single machine on this list. Not showmanship, not spectacle for its own sake, just one retired engineer had a set of ordinary hand tools and an absolute refusal to accept that something can't be done simply because nobody's tried it before. 10 motorcycles, 0 factories. One garage that, by rights, should have its own blue plaque. If this is the sort of British engineering madness you can't get enough of, the shed-built geniuses, the quietly brilliant obsessives who've spent their lives proving the impossible, is really just the untried, then you're exactly who this channel was built for. Give this video a like if Allen Millyard has earned a permanent spot on your list of national treasures, and let us know down in the comments which of these 10 machines you'd choose to ride home on, if you were mad enough to be offered the choice. Subscribe, ring that notification bell, because we've got plenty more stories like this one on the way. The men, the machines, and the quietly extraordinary corners of British life that most of the world never gets to see. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and we'll see you in the next one.